It's easy right now to wonder how large organizations like the World Bank can impact real people around the world. But they do play a very crucial role in fighting poverty. And last year, Global Citizen joined forces with leaders and artists and musicians around the world to launch a new campaign, Power Our Planet. And as part of that campaign, we pushed for what we call debt pause clauses to grant disaster-stricken countries, many of them in the Pacific, in our own backyard, breathing room for recovery. And countries facing disasters like floods and hurricanes now will receive a break from repaying their debts to focus on their recovery. And in 2023, Pacific nations faced devastating cyclones and floods. To put this into perspective, had Pakistan had a debt pause clause when it was faced with severe flooding back in a year ago, it could have received up to $33 billion that could have instead been spent on emergency response, rebuilding, and recovery efforts instead of repaying loans. So we mobilized our 12 million global citizens around the world, and alongside some massive artists like Billie Eilish, Lenny Kravitz, and Her, to generate more than 250,000 actions, urging the World Bank to support disaster relief. And our many voices were heard by the biggest leaders in the world. And as a result, the new president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, announced a 2-year loan repayment pause for disaster-stricken countries at the Global Citizen Festival and Power Our Planet in Paris last year. And this was just the beginning. Now we focus on the World Bank's International Development Association, which is a crucial mechanism that provides low-cost loans to some of the poorest countries around the world. We'll be hearing more about that. And now we're urging some of the wealthiest countries in the world, such as Australia, to step up and give much-needed support. So now, let's have a conversation with Anna and Michael and dive into this a little bit more detail. And so, Anna, thank you for traveling all this way. Really appreciate it. The World Bank, some people will look at this and say, well, this big institution, it was founded over 80 years ago, before the world's first general-purpose computer was even built. How are these stuffy old institutions stepping up and responding to the biggest crisis of our time, whether that's pandemics or climate change?
So thank you for that intro. I want to make clear that I wasn't there 80 years ago before the computers, but it really always call the need for the World Bank to evolve and respond to the needs of people around the world, just as we did with the debt pause clause, which I'm so proud of and I think really provides a great support to countries. So when a disaster strikes, they can focus on responding and not on repaying debt to the World Bank. So we're really pleased to be there. The World Bank, since its start, has been around reducing poverty, eliminating poverty worldwide. And in a reflection of hearing and seeing what's happening around the world, we're updating and renewing. So now that mandate, that vision, that goal is a world free of poverty on a livable planet. It's on the front door of the World Bank as of last fall, and it really recognizes how issues of development, betterment of people go hand in hand with the health of our planet, including climate change. For me, as someone who's always worked in sustainable development, I'm delighted. I've spent my career working on it, as have many others in the bank. But the fact now that it's recognized as central really reflects these needs on the ground. And hearing from people in groups like this helps us to renew and update what we do and put at the disposition of citizens around the world the resources, both financial and technical, of the World Bank. We're doing things like now dedicating a full 45% of all of our financing worldwide to climate action, including half of that to adaptation, which is really crucial for areas of the world like this, Asia-Pacific region, where they're so vulnerable to the impacts of climate adaptation, whether it's the atoll nations and sea level rise, or a lot of the industry here in Asia that's dependent on things like fisheries or agriculture, tourism, things that are really impacted by a changing climate. So for us, that really push on climate financing, money to help countries mitigate what causes climate change and adapt to the impacts is super important. We're also working heavily to bring in the private sector. So just a few numbers. The latest estimates I've seen are that getting infrastructure resilient so that it can stay in place when it's impacted by climate disasters like floods, and helping countries adapt in low and middle income countries, it's something like $3 to $6 trillion a year by the end of the decade. It's a big number, and it's even a big number for all of the multilateral development banks and for governments. So we really need to bring in the private sector. It's something the World Bank is working on really heartily to try and use things like guarantees to reduce the risk to the private sector so they invest more. So we are updating, we're listening, we're learning, and I think one of the things are that because we are an institution, we have capacities that we really put to play on countries.
So let me just push you a little, if I may, because yesterday we had Michael's opposite number here in the House, Pat Conroy, Minister for International Development, and I'll come to you in a sec, Michael, so hold on a sec. But first, to you, Anna. He was very critical of big institutions. He said in his view, they're not doing enough in the Pacific, in Australia's backyard. And so he said, why should countries like Australia be contributing? And we've got many advocates here from across the region from the Pacific. But what do you say to that? And how is the World Bank stepping up in this region?
So I think the Pacific have big problems and big challenges ahead, and big institutions can really play a role in that. It's not an issue for big institutions like the World Bank alone. It's about really having strong partnerships, helping the countries themselves. The institutional capacity in these islands is very difficult, not for fault of the islands, but they're small countries and they're very geographically isolated, so they need a lot of support, and the World Bank is there. When we up our climate financing, a lot of that's going to small countries and really helping them direct their funding and their investments to places that can have the biggest impact. Importantly, one thing I think that's on all of the big multilateral banks, whether it's the ADB, the AIIB, or the World Bank, is working together, especially with island countries that have less institutional capacity, that we come with an efficient platform, a joint team, a team that shares and supports the countries as one with the same standards, the same approaches and priorities, so that we really give them a unified team rather than a bunch of individual players. Thanks.
So Michael, I'll come to you now. Yesterday, Minister Conroy, I asked him, I said, we're all here, we're playing our part, but what is his plan to increase Australia's support for aid and development? And he outlined the fact that they were putting in $1.7 billion into the aid budget over the coming years. And he specifically said, tomorrow, ask Michael what his plan is, and will they at least commit to match what I've already put in? So over to
I hear the murmurings of laughter here. And look, it is important, and we must do more, and we will do more, and we'll do it, I think, in a bipartisan way. When I became the Shadow Minister for International Development and the Pacific, the first person I rang was Pat Conroy. I didn't ring my wife, Catherine. I rang Pat, and I said I was really looking forward to working with him, because I think whatever we do in this space, we should be doing in a bipartisan way. And there is a collective agreement across the Parliament that we can and we must and we will do more for the Pacific. Now, I appreciate that Pat is talking about money going forward and forward estimates, and currently I think it stands at $4.77 billion in ODA. And, a lot of that, much of that is in the Pacific, and as well it should. It is our backyard. We are very much part of the Pacific, and we need to ensure, Anna mentioned climate resilient infrastructure. That is so important. I think it's incumbent not just on governments to do more, not just on nations to do more, but on organisations such as World Bank, indeed the Asian Development Bank, but even right down to our big four to do more in this space. And they can do more even in little things such as not charging the fees on remittances, so that when people from the Pacific come here and work and do some wonderful things for Australian industry, that the money that they send back home, some of which is their largest economic driver, not have the fees and charges when they withdraw that money for their communities and their families back home.
And so just to dive a little bit deeper into that, we know that governments, and by the way, I should just say, we throw around numbers like $4 or $5 billion, and it can sound like a lot to the average Australian, but we should put in perspective that that's really less than 1% of the government's entire federal budget, and I think that's a message we should all spread around when we get the tabloids criticising aid and development. But just to come back to a point you made there, we know government can't do everything by itself, right? That's a critical message we've heard. how should we be partnering with institutions like the World Bank? We've got Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, who just made a great commitment yesterday to introduce vaccines into Timor-Leste. We had the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which we're still waiting for a response from Pat Conroy. The Duchess of York did try her best yesterday, by the way, so there's a story on that later on.
I'll catch up with him the week after next and lean on him a little.
But like, what's your view? Should we be signing up to these institutions like EFAD? Should we be partnering more in the region?
EFAD, we should be. We can do so much in the space of agriculture, and I saw that firsthand when I went to Kenya and went to Turkana West and saw the women apiarists. And if we can do more in the agriculture space, we can lift the amount of food. We can lift their ability to be able to have more food within their own countries, but indeed export to the world. And some of the activities that organisation is doing are quite remarkable. I understand why we left the organisation in the first place, but we should be re-entering it, and I'll be having another chat with Pat when we get back to Parliament. I like Penny Wong and Pat Conroy. They're good people. They come with good intentions, and like I say, we can do so much more on a bipartisan level. When you mention funding, interesting, and I just prepared this one earlier. In fact, Matt gave it to me out the back. Gavi and ACFID and Global Citizen. That's the if you can see that, it's the percentage of funding on 2023 levels. You see it's at a high point under the coalition. But like I say, we can and we must do more. Just thought I'd show that one for the sake of the audience. And I do thank the audience too. I don't regard you as activists as such. I know somebody mentioned the word activist before, but I regard you as advocates. And you should be advocates for change. Global Citizen is doing some amazing things, and we should really get behind what they're doing and promote it at every opportunity.
So can I let's give that a big shout out. And for our social media team, why don't we send some tweets to Pat Conroy? Michael McCormack says we should be rejoining EFAD and see what the minister has to say about it. But that's a great point. Anna, I want to come back to you. You know, you're here, you're launching this big campaign with the World Bank later this year. What do you want to see from Australia? And importantly, how can we, and Michael's right, we've got advocates from across the nation, and the region, very diverse audience. How can we support?
Absolutely. So one is, I think, being together here and speaking out on the issues that matter. So we just spoke about the importance of international development and how what happens beyond the borders of Australia is critical for Australians. So that idea of understanding how the connections between the countries take place, the importance of climate change, the importance of economic growth across the countries really matters. So I think speaking out in your own country, your support will make a difference. Beyond that, we really look for partnerships. So you talked before about the World Bank being a big organization. There's some things we are really well geared up to do, and there are other things where we can do more for countries with partnerships, with NGOs, with academia. So really that openness to partner on big issues makes a difference in the impact we can have. Thank you.
Michael, what's your advice? You're often now charged in the coalition with being the spokesperson for international development. But what's your advice and tips for us on how to effectively persuade politicians and others, members of the community, to increased support for Australian aid?
Praise is always good. So when government does something right, let them know. We all too often get condemnation publicly and via email about what we're not doing. If they are doing something and you see that, tell them. Socialise it on your media platforms, but also write to your local member and advocate for change. Michael's wearing "Safer World for All." Isn't that a great thing that we should be all championing? And these sorts of programs, these sorts of projects, these sorts of organisations are doing so much good in the world. Get behind them. See what you can do. And at the end of the day too. This little thing, it's called water. There's so many communities in the world, nations in the world, where fresh water isn't a norm. It isn't a common thing. I mean, it should be an absolute minimum. And we can do so much more in the space of enabling these countries to have the right infrastructure in the right places right now. World Bank can only do so much. It also comes back to each and every one of us.
Michael, last question. When we first met, you told me how you had recently visited, or I guess 18 months ago, some of the famine-stricken areas in Kenya, in that part of the world. And you came back and you worked across government and the opposition, and you secured bipartisan support for more extra funding for responding to famine. But what was it about that trip? Can you share us a little bit about the stories you encounter and how that motivated you and made you a more powerful advocate?
I think when you go to some of those remote communities and you see babies dying in their mother's arms, if that doesn't move you and inspire you and just jerk you into doing something about it, then there's something other than blood coursing through your veins. And I worked with Penny Wong. I worked across the political divide to make sure that we did provide more assistance. Was it what they requested? No, it wasn't everything, but it was certainly a generous contribution from Australia's behalf. And when you see those communities who, have so little, and yet you see the organisations such as the Fred Hollows Foundation, who with something like $20 American can give sight to somebody who has not been able to see because of lack of fresh water, haven't been able to see for 20 years. That's an incredibly moving experience. When you see what we can do with so little, it makes it such a powerful message. And to be able to come back to get that funding assistance, to be able to tell the world via the Daily Telegraph and via an op-ed, it's the least I can do. But it's also a powerful message to others because you don't realise how powerful you are. And I know I followed on from Zed Zelja. I admire the work that he did in this space. And I do admire the work that Penny Wong, the advocacy that she has done, and also with Simon Birmingham. I mean, there is a collective good here, and we can do more. Like I said before, we will do more, and we must do more.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Anna. Please join me. Let's give our guests a wonderful round of applause. Thank you so much.